So last week we started talking about this thing called the Gospel of Thomas, and just a little review for those that maybe weren't here or forgot. Well, it happens, right? The Gospel of Thomas was among a couple of dozen books that were found in a clay jar by a farmer in Egypt in 1945, a place called Nag Hammadi. And it's believed that quite likely these books were from the library at Alexandria, which was burned, a long time ago, and probably somebody took them out and buried them so they would be safe. And there's a number of books in there that are considered Gnostic in tone. Thomas is not considered a Gnostic gospel, although it's commonly referred to as one. And I'm not going to get into the reasons, but it has to do with basically the Gnostics did not believe at all in the divinity of Jesus, whereas Thomas believed, what you can gather from Thomas was that Jesus believed in the divinity of all people, which is kind of a little different take than what are called the canonical Gospels, which is the four you've heard of, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are in the New Testament. And there was a whole process of selecting those over the course of quite a long time, finally culminating in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea, where the existing Bible as we know it sort of was finally put together. There were about 20 or 30 Gospels that were being used by Christian groups all around the Mediterranean, from North Africa all the way around to what is now France. And some groups used this group of Gospels, and some groups used that group of Gospels. And Gospel of Thomas was apparently fairly popular at the time, and but it didn't make the cut when they did the whole thing. So then anything, the policy was, or the practice or the declaration was, when they did put the Bible together, that anything else was heretical and had to be destroyed. So any earlier translations or versions of even the books that got into the existing Bible were to be done away with. And for the most part, that was done. There have been some remnants and so forth of earlier versions of some of the canonical Gospels, but they did a pretty thorough job of getting rid of them all around the region. So Andrew Harvey, who is one of my favorite commentators on the Gospel of Thomas, said this: "The Gospel of Thomas really is, I believe, the clearest guide we have to the vision of the world's supreme mystical revolutionary, the teacher known as Jesus." And this is what the books look like when they were found. And the Gospel of Thomas is 113 sayings. There's no narrative. There's no birth story. There's no crucifixion story. There's no resurrection. There's no miracles are described in any of these sayings. There are a few partial parables. There are about 5 or 6 disciples mentioned, 3 of whom are women, and stuff like that. So about a half to 2/3 of what's in the Gospel of Thomas appears mostly in an edited version in the other Gospels. And it's believed that this was one of the source materials for the canonical Gospels, although a lot of the sayings where they appear in the canonical Gospels have been changed. Okay. So last week we went over a few of the sayings, and today we're going to do a couple of more. And these are some of the ones that seem to be the most important in understanding what was Jesus' mission, what was his teaching really all about. And I'm going to begin with saying one, this to kind of lay the groundwork. And this says, "These are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Thomas wrote down. And he said, whoever finds the correct interpretation of these sayings will never die." Now, it was very common in that day for people to have teachings that were only for what were called adepts. In other words, certain teachings were reserved for people that were ready to hear them, that were more advanced in their understanding. The Kabbalah, which many of you may be familiar with, which is passed down primarily orally, was only taught to students that were kind of ready, that had the spiritual understanding to be at a certain level. And it's not unusual to see this kind of statement early in some of those early texts, that these are not for everybody, because most people simply will not understand what they mean. And you can kind of see, if you've been paying attention, that over the years, in terms of the sacred scriptures, mainly in the West, of the Talmud and of the Bible and of the Quran, that there's been a few misunderstandings over time. You may have noticed that. So in saying 8, he says, and he said, he being Jesus, the man is like a thoughtful fisherman who threw his net into the sea and pulled it out, should be out, full of little fish. Among the little fish, that thoughtful fisherman found one large, fine fish that would be beneficial to him. And throwing all the little fish back into the sea, he easily chose to keep the large one. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. And that's again one of those statements that probably everybody won't understand the meaning of this, because there is a surface meaning and there is a deeper meaning. And the surface meaning is that if you think about it, you catch, you want the finest of what's in the catch. But when you think about it, somebody making their living from fishing, can they really throw back the little fish? Is that kind of a smart way to be fishing, where you throw back 99% of your catch and try to survive on the rest? So obviously there's a deeper meaning here. And Andrew Harvey talks about it in this way. He says, if you really want to become a mystical revolutionary, dedicating your life to seeing and enacting kingdom consciousness, and again, as we talked about last week, the idea of the kingdom of God being within and without is part of the Gospel of Thomas statements. If you want to see and enact kingdom consciousness, you're going to have to surrender all conventional ways of being, acting, or living, and all conventional games of status and power. So the message, and you see this often in the canonical Gospels, where somebody will say to Jesus, what do I need to do to follow you? And he says, you have to leave your family. You have to give up everything you own and follow me. And again, on the surface level, it's like get rid of all your possessions. But what he's really saying is you have to get rid of all the conventional ways that you've learned to see reality and step into a much larger, much more radical idea of what reality is. And what reality is in Jesus' context is that we live in a world of unending and overabundant love. And until we realize that, we create all kinds of structures in our culture that are based primarily on fear and fear of one another. So the message of Jesus becomes threatening, or message like Jesus becomes threatening to those who live in fear and depend on the structures of the culture to protect them. And he comes through kind of trashing all that, and it makes people nervous. Okay, they get a little upset. He goes on to say the fire that Jesus has thrown and is constantly throwing on the world is the fire of a revolutionary, transcendent, and imminent knowledge of a love that menaces the world's political, social, economic, and religious elite. How does this look? In looking at the online stuff around what happened in Boston this past week. Now, many of you know my background. I was in law enforcement, and I have a number of Facebook friends from those days, and it was interesting to see their perspective, They were very disappointed that the Boston police didn't kill the second guy. Said any cop worth his salt would make sure that guy never walked out alive. That was a fairly common kind of a response. And so forth. And, it's a worldview. And it's not universal among police officers, but it's fairly common. It's not limited to police officers. You may have heard some of that from some of your friends or from other people, or some of you may have thought it yourself. When you start speaking about an event like that and responding with love, people feel so threatened because they think if you respond with love, it means we're all going to be in danger. That you've got to have fear, you've got to put up the walls, you've got to defend yourself because the world is a very scary place, because most people believe in a power called evil, that is as a power rather than as simply the absence of the presence of love, just as darkness is the absence of the presence of light. And the other part, as I mentioned in the little prayer we did earlier, was that anyone who does anything to harm anyone else is seeing themselves from a wounded perspective. That doesn't mean they're not dangerous, but it does mean that they're acting from an absence of something rather than a presence of something. And the absence that they're acting from is the realization of who they really are. When you feel that you are worthy, when you feel that you have something to contribute, when you feel that you have just simply a sense of self-acceptance and self-value, you don't go out and hurt people. And part of the problem is we let other people determine for us whether or not we should feel that way. The two young men who seemed to be the ones that were involved in this, came from another country. They were Islamic. I don't imagine they got a real warm welcome over here. And they were here through their formative growing up years, in their teens and early 20s. Imagine if you'd have been dropped into a foreign culture that saw you as a negative person when you were 12 or 14 or 16 and spent all that time there. And you find your way, but it's hard to see yourself as valuable. It's hard to see yourself as worthy. It's hard to see yourself as safe. And I'm not making excuses. I'm simply saying we have to point out these realities because that's what's going on. And if we don't deal with the cause issues, if we don't learn to create a culture that's different than it is now, it's sort of like a game of whack-a-mole. You can try to smack the heads of the things when they pop up. Every time one of these folks gets mad and decides to do something like this, we can try to deal with it in a law enforcement way. Or you can pull the plug on the machine. You can have a defensive life and a defensive posture about everything, or you can take the energy out of the evil. See, and that's what Jesus was talking about. That's why it's so radical, it's so unusual, it's so strange. We go into that fear mode, and we have that reptilian brain starts firing, and it's all about fear. The reptilian brain only knows fear. And when the reptilian brain is activated, it takes over. Which is good in a lot of cases. That makes you step on the brake pedal much quicker when you see brake lights in front of you. But it also makes us react in ways that maybe we would choose not to had we had time to think about it. The next saying, we're going to talk about saying 13. Jesus asked his disciples to make a comparison. What am I like? And Simon Peter replied, you are like a righteous messenger. And Matthew replied, you are like an intelligent lover of wisdom. You've probably seen these people in staff meetings. Thomas replied, teacher, I cannot possibly say what you are like. Jesus said to Thomas, I am not your teacher. You have drunk from and become intoxicated from the bubbling water that I poured out. Jesus took Thomas and they withdrew. Jesus said 3 things to him. When Thomas returned to the other disciples, they asked him, what did Jesus tell you? Thomas replied, if I tell you even one of the sayings he told me, you would pick up stones and throw them at me, and fire would come out of those stones and burn you up. So what's being said here, see, why did Jesus take Thomas aside? Because he was the only one that said, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what you are. So he was teachable. And he took him aside. And again, this is all symbolic. He took him aside and he told him 3 things that he was ready to hear, but Thomas recognized that the others were not. And this kind of thing is dealt with in the canonical Gospels, and the thing where Jesus says, do not cast your pearls before swine. Which means don't waste your time with people that don't get it. Until they're ready to get it, they're not going to get it. You ever notice that? People that don't get it never know they don't get it. So you say, you don't get it. I don't see what you're talking about. Right? Andrew Harvey said, what saying 13 makes clear is that what Jesus most wanted was to set others on fire with the same fire with which he himself had been ignited, so that they, like him, could realize their own divinity. If you go to India and you walk down the street and you say to someone, you're God, or you say, I'm God, they don't That's not a surprising statement to make. Yeah. So, but around here, if you go around, even in L.A., if you go up and say I'm God, you're probably going to get some odd looks, right? And if you say it enough, you're liable to see what the inside of a padded room looks like. Let those who have ears that can hear. Have we cultivated the inner work to hear the truth in a way that we can manifest it more powerfully in our lives? Or are what we tend to do is we're going through that spiritual growth process. If we hear this stuff, it sounds good, but we find ways to deflect it and not put it into our lives, don't we? A little bit, some of us, maybe, just once. In saying 22, Jesus saw infants being suckled. Must have gone to the mall. He said to his disciples, "These infants taking milk are like those who enter the kingdom." His disciples asked him, "If we are infants, will we enter the kingdom?" Kind of like a Greek chorus here. Jesus responded, this is very interesting, when you make the two into one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the upper like the lower, and the lower like the upper, and thus make the male and the female the same, so that the male isn't male and the female isn't female. When you make an eye to replace an eye, and a hand to replace a hand, and a foot to replace a foot, and an image to replace an image, then you will enter the kingdom. Thank you, and have a nice day. Did you get that out there in TV land? Okay. Let's read this again. When you make the two into one, when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the upper like the lower, and the lower like the upper. What is he saying here? Oneness. And we understand, as within, so without, as above, so below. And we understand that when you make that, he's talking about when you get it. That you and I are not separate, that you and your Creator are not separate. That everything that happens within you happens outside of you, and what happens outside of you is a reflection of what's happening within you. And what's in you determines how you interpret what's happening outside of you, and what you make of it, and what you create out of it. So that's one step. And thus make the male and the female the same, so that the male isn't male and the female isn't female. This is the pairs of opposites in duality that when they are merged together, male and female are the two ends of the creative spectrum. So creativity is the mastering of these poles of opposites. When you make an eye to replace an eye, and a hand to replace a hand, and a foot to replace a foot, and an image to replace an image, then you will enter the kingdom. This is where you become dominant over your physical world. Which means what? You recognize that the physical responds to the mental, and you know how to do that. Spiritual healing, manifestation, whatever you want to call it, that's what he's talking about here. So there are four linked truths in this saying. The first is the kingdom consciousness in the infants born from the marriage of opposites. Those infants contain within them the masculine and the feminine, heart and mind, soul and body. And they are, if you will, uncorrupted or unconfused. Not that they're wise. They don't have wisdom. But they also don't have anything to block their good. That's not part of who they are. The second is the agency of this transformation is seen in the motherhood of God, the divine feminine. The feminine, the mother, the aspects of God. Only this within and without perspective can allow someone to be open to being fed directly by God. So the symbolism of the mother suckling the infant is you being nurtured by the Spirit within. And are we aware that that's happening? Or are we cursing God because we believe that our life is not working out? The third is the order of transformation to be seen by every seeker within this statement. First, making the two into one, knowing oneness, in the terms of that inside-outside, above-below. Second is opening of the heart center, dissolving all distinctions. We would call this today the transformation of the egoic self in psychological terms, where your heart breaks open and all of a sudden the world is different. And that may be driven by by spiritual practices or an intention thing. It may be driven by a cathartic event in your life. You know, people will say, why do things like Boston happen? You know, from a collective consciousness viewpoint. Because if you look at the collective consciousness as an organism, all organisms seek their own healing. An organism that is rife with a consciousness of fear will seek to heal by creating events that give people an opportunity to be knocked out of their own imbalance, if you will. You know, there's a saying, never let a crisis go to waste. And what that means is if you're really knocked off center by something, that means you need to look at something because you weren't on center. If you're on center, you can't get knocked off. You could only be knocked off of a false path. So if you say, boy, I really got knocked for a loop, look at that. That's a teachable moment. That's a moment when the universe is saying to you, pay attention. Realign. Get in a different groove. That's what this means. Third, the collapse of all categories, high and low, sacred and profane, the presence in all things. A hand is a hand, a foot is a foot. No categories, no differences, everything's one. No divisions, no tribes, no family divisions, no divisions at all. I love the Ram Dass quote, we're all just walking each other home. And some of us are going kicking and screaming. Right? Fourth, the physical transformation that mystical union makes possible. Direction over the physical self and the world. Transfiguration by the realization of the living light of spirit. In other words, how does a healing occur? You know, in this teaching began out of healing. Pretty much physical healing was the focus. Back in the late 1800s, first half of the 20th century, heliotropic medicine, Western medicine, wasn't very good at what they did. People weren't as educated in analytical understanding of medical practices and things as they are now. People were, when you saw somebody that had some mojo, you were willing to go listen to them because you were hurting. And this whole teaching began, all the New Thought teachings began on people speaking their word and healing resulting. Physical being transformed as the result of the word. And it still happens. It happens all the time. How do we get to a place where not only are we amazed by that, but we say, of course, that's just the natural flow of things? How many of us are so skeptical when we see a healing like that? Sometimes you're so skeptical you've had the healing and you talk yourself out of it and you're sick again in a couple of weeks. Well, I can't quite figure out how this happened, so I don't trust it. There's something going on, so, oh, good, I'm sick again. Okay, my world makes sense. So, Edgar Mitchell was an astronaut. And on the way back from the moon, on Apollo 12, he, or 14, he had a mystical experience. He had one of these transcendent, being one with everything experiences, and got back and became very interested in psychic phenomena and in mental healing and things like that. And there came a time when his mother, who lived in Texas, a little town in Texas, had cataracts. And she was scheduled for surgery. And he said, Mom, before you do that, I know this shaman, he's about, it was about a 2-hour drive from her house, and he picked her up and took her out to see this Native American shaman, and the Native American shaman did whatever he did. And he took his mom back home. Next morning she woke up, no cataracts. They're gone, completely gone. Went to the doctor to make sure. Completely healed. Says about 6 weeks later, I get a call from her. You know, I've been thinking, I don't think that him getting rid of my cataracts was possible. And I'm worried about it. 2 weeks later, the cataracts were back. Now, she did it both times. That's what we have to understand. She did it both times. The shaman gave her permission to believe her own word, because sometimes we need to extend. We need somebody to kind of let us extend our belief out. Oh, he's got the mojo. That was Jesus walking around with the seamless garment, coming down the road, and people saying, hey, here he comes. Get all your sick people out by the curb. Would you heal me? Would you heal me? And he would say, get up and walk. Thy faith has healed you. Healed thee. You know, they didn't say it that. That's Old English. He said, get up and walk, man. You're cool. And they get up and walk. Your faith has healed you. But see, they needed Jesus. They needed to believe in him to extend the belief to allow the healing to occur, but it was still their own belief. Does that make sense? You do the same thing when you go to anybody you go to for assistance with your well-being. Some of us need, we need a surgeon to extend our belief to. We need a pill. But it's the same thing. See, all the pills don't work the same way on the different people, do they? What's going on? Mm-hmm. How come placebos work? The placebo effect is now up to 40% in tests. It's almost better than the drugs. Because it's the same thing. I just want a bottle of placebos. And I don't even need that. That's training wheels. When do we take off the training wheels and recognize we have our own balance? We can get there ourselves. That's what he's talking about. The integral transformation necessary to provide the force and inspiration to change that must occur if humanity is to survive. We can't keep going the way we're going. We're too sophisticated and too dumb at the same time. We can do too much damage to each other. We're slowly bleeding the planet dry because we're afraid. We need an incredible transformation. And here's the benefit. People say, well, if everybody's not going to do it, why should I do it? Because if you do it, A, your life works. And B, you influence others. Simple as that. Andrew says the Gospel of Thomas and the Jesus who gave it to us continue to challenge us to dare to become one with the divine and start living the revolutionary life that streams from union with the divine, the awareness of oneness, and that can transform all things. He says despair is the final illusion. Nobody can figure this out for you but yourself. Nobody can make your life work but you. There isn't a government program that's possible that can transform a life unless that life transforms on the inside. Our daughter Grace was at the finish line of the Boston Marathon 30 minutes before the bombs went off. I like to think it's her consciousness that she decided she was hungry and went to get something to eat and didn't even know what happened. What am I receptive to? What consciousness? She's raised in this teaching. She's a manifester. She knows how to manifest. And the unconscious, your unconscious knows how to take care of you at the level that you have developed your unconscious. You just get an idea. I think I'll go stand over here. And you walk towards something good. And you walk away from something that would have been harmful. And a less developed consciousness can say, I think I'll go stand over here. Boom. It's not about blame. It's just recognizing how energy works. So the message of this incredible document, which does take some interpretation, I will agree, but the message of it is that I think it's pretty clear why, if they did crucify Jesus, why they did it. He scared the hell out of them. Or he scared the heaven out of them. He constantly confronted the authorities with their own fears and their own inability to express life as they really wanted to express it. He confronted them and challenged them to say, all you're doing is trying to defend against something that isn't real. And in creating those defenses, you do more harm than good. So we have social systems today, as they had then, that devastate people, that are uneven. 30,000 children die a year from starvation on this planet. Old news. Half the food that's produced on this planet rots on the ground. And we go, well, what are you going to do? There's a Whole Foods near me. I can go there. These other people that are starving, they should get themselves up and, move to the valley. Why don't they just take care of themselves? What do you think the consciousness is in the third world of expectations of what's possible? Who's going to show them the way? Who's going to invite them in rather than persecute them once they get here? So I think if Jesus was around today, they'd have him in Guantanamo. He may be there. You got to get people like that out of the way if you're part of the status quo. And that's just the way it is. And it's not to say the status quo is evil or anything. They're just ignorant. Ignorance is the easiest thing in the world to cure. You cure it with knowledge. And we're all ignorant of one thing or another or many things. What Thomas Edison said, we know less than 1/1,000,000 of 1% about anything. And that's enough. But we got to get wiser. We got to wake up. We got to let ourselves recognize that we have the answers already. The answers to all of our problems, all of your problems, all of everybody's problems are already here. But they can only come through a clear consciousness that's willing to do the work of aligning yourself with the truth of your being. I'm going to go think about that for 6 weeks. Thank you. And namaste.